So welcome to everybody watching on YouTube, and thank you so much for being here on Land Day for our event, Indigenous Solidarity, Our Struggles Unite. My name is Sorsha. I'm a member of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign Youth and Student Committee, and I'll be chairing this evening's event. I'm getting some lag. Sorry, I was receiving some feedback from YouTube. We can continue now. So today is Land Day, and 45 years ago today, 6 Palestinian citizens of Israel were killed by Israeli police as they were protesting the expropriation of Palestinian lands as part of mass collection action across historic Palestine in that year, 1976. Since then, March the 30th has been commemorated by Palestinians everywhere as Land Day. It is a day that highlights Palestinian resistance to the ongoing colonial efforts to displace, dispossess, and dominate their people and their lands. This year also marks 2 years since the beginning of the Great March of Return, the movement calling for the lift of the siege on Gaza and the implementation of the right of return for Palestinian refugees. In resistance, it is a day that reminds us that the domination of space is integral to the ongoing Zionist settler colonial project. And it also reminds us of the complicity of the international community and our governments in the continuation of this project. Across the world, Indigenous people continue to resist settler colonialism and its practices of surveillance, containment, military checkpoints, police brutality, theft of resources and land, and environmental destruction. Indigenous activists from Turtle Island to Khirbet Humsa, Standing Rock to Haifa, are standing together to resist parallel colonial agendas, learning together and strengthening mutual resistance to racial and colonial violence and injustice. Today, we are joined by activists from Indigenous solidarity movements to discuss how we can build our struggles against settler colonialism wherever it may be found. It is my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today, Malek Rosamni and Matt Peterson, directors and producers of the Native and the Refugee Project, a multimedia project profiling the spaces of the Indian reservation and the Palestinian refugee camps, spaces of exception whose positions in the struggle for Native and Palestinian autonomy are essential. The Native and the Refugee Project will culminate in a feature-length documentary film, and today they're going to introduce and show 2 of their short films. We also have Mark Luchford, chair of the Western Sahara Campaign UK. The Western Sahara Campaign works in solidarity with the Sahrawi people to generate political support in order to advance their right to self-determination and to promote their human rights. And finally, we have Nidal Batari, a Syrian-Palestinian writer based in Washington, D.C., USA. He holds a master's in political sociology and is managing director for People Demand Change. He previously worked for the Syrian Arab Red Crescent and the Danish Red Cross. Before I hand over to Malek and Matt, some housekeeping. If there are any glitches on the YouTube channel, please bear with us. It should come back live as soon as possible. And please leave any comments you might have in the comment section, and ensure that all comments and contributions adhere to the values of PSC. This includes an opposition to all forms of discrimination. Anyone violating this is subject to removal from the event. So thank you once again for joining us, and to all our speakers. I'll now pass over to Malek and Matt.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here with the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, talking about the Native and the Refugee. I'm going to say a few words really briefly introducing the project and the films we're going to see. And then Matt and I will come back after the short films with some comments before, I guess, turning it over to the other speakers. The Native and the Refugee is a project that Matt Peterson and I began 7 years ago. As you said, the idea was to kind of put in dialogue the Palestinian and Native struggle, the Native struggle in the United States and the Palestinian struggle in the Middle East, through specifically the lens of looking at the Native reservation as a space and the Palestinian refugee camp as a space, and as well as the communities that live inside those spaces. Because it's really our contention that the Palestinian refugee camp has played a central role in the Palestinian struggle. And I think simultaneously the Native reservation has also played a central role in the struggle for native sovereignty, you could say, in the United States in the 20th century. We can discuss more about the role of land in each of those cases. I think land plays an important role in each of those spaces, but perhaps in opposite ways. And we can even talk about specific events. But the films you're going to see now the first one is A History of the Camp, which is a kind of takes a look at the entire diasporic experience throughout many different Palestinian refugee camps in a subtle way. I don't want to speak too much about it because you're going to watch it. And the second film, All My Relations, is about the Standing Rock movement, which is a movement that took place on a native reservation, or right next to a native reservation, the Standing Rock Reservation. For those of you who aren't aware, it was a movement to prevent the building of a pipeline that was going to pass over under the Missouri River and through the Standing Rock Reservation. And this was a movement that saw maybe the largest pan-native gathering in at least the last 100 years, if not more, bringing together Native people from across the United States, although it was focused around the Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota. That's all I'm going to say for now, but we have a lot more to discuss afterwards. But I hope you guys enjoy the films. And again, thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here.
Yeah, this is Matt. I just wanted to chime in a bit. Again, thanks again for having us. I'm happy to be here and be part of this broader discussion. About a year and a half ago, before the pandemic, we had a similar event in London, live in person, where we brought together struggles. The project Malik and I do, as he was saying, is focused on Palestinian refugee camps and American Indian reservations in the United States. But that event we did brought in the Kurdish movement, Kashmir, and Western Sahara to think about the ideas of statelessness and, the experience of indigeneity and what those terms mean and how they can be applied in different contexts around the world, and basically what happens to all those people and spaces that are left out of the nation state kind of form of governance that has become, dominant or hegemonic over the last hundreds of years. And to think about the kind of contemporary legacy and experience of settler colonialism as a contemporary phenomenon, not something that happened in the past that we think about or study, something to think about, but what are its contemporary experiences, and where is it taking place, and what does it look like? And Malik and myself are American and Lebanese and grew up in cities, in New York and Beirut. We are not Indigenous or Palestinian. But that was precisely why we were interested in this project and these spaces of the camp and the reservation, to think about these spaces that are not, where we were in New York or Beirut, but in some cases we're quite close. And the living experience or remnant of settler colonialism may not be that far from where certain metropolitan society exists, and to think about what that means and looks like. And for us, as a kind of anthropological project, for lack of a better word, we wanted to visit the places and document them, audio visually, and bring those documents. And also, I should say, we wanted to put them in dialogue. So a lot of the films that we made, films that we made in Palestinian camps, we screened and discussed in American Indian reservations and vice versa, to kind of bring these experiences to help kind of hopefully illuminate or think about some of the structural dynamics or kind of shared practices, both by the national colonial governments, but also the forms of resistance taking place within these experiences. So that's broadly our project. We have a website, it's thenativeandtherefugee.com. We made about a dozen short films and one feature-length film, and we've done a lot of writings and presentations around the project. So we're happy to be here and share two of the short films that Malik introduced a bit ago. And then I'm looking forward to having a discussion, both with the other panelists, especially Nidal, to talk about, his experiences in Syria and in the diaspora, and kind of bring that into dialogue with the Sahrawi movements and struggles, but also, hopefully people that are watching it can participate as well and write in any questions or comments you might have about the films or about the whole project, basically. So thanks again for having me. I look forward to discussing all this with you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this
الآن 35 بلد موجودة في مخيم العرب. فكانت أكبر قرية العراق المنشية. العراق المنشية هي مأخوذة من كلمة جت. جت هي كلمة يونانية، وهي أول قرية وجدت على وجه الأرض. اللي هي العراق المنشية قريات جت سموها مشان يجيبوا الاسم القديم اللي هو جت. وجت قتل فيها جالوت، وقتل داوود جالوت وآتاه الله الملك. انقتل جالوت في بلدنا. احنا بلدنا هي آخر بلد خرجت في فلسطين. فأرادوا تهجيرنا، إحنا رفضنا الهجرة. فأجوا كتلوا شباب 2 من بلدنا مشان يعملوا إرهاب على أساس الناس تطلب الهجرة. فإحنا برضو رفضنا الهجرة. والشعب الفلسطيني ناضل وكافح وشرد وأهين، وفي النهاية ثمان دول عربية على أساس إنه يساندونا. وكانت مهمة الدول العربية هي تسليم الأراضي لإسرائيل. كانت مهمة الدول العربية تسليم الأراضي لإسرائيل. فكان لما تهجيرنا جابوا سيارات حملوا السكان بالقوة، نزل من السيارات اليهودية في السيارات الأردنية. وجينا هنا وجدنا المخيم منصوب عنا.
هلك لوراء، هلك والله وخرجونا 2.
نعم، الخيام كانت منصوبة عندنا، كانت المي من تحتينا تجري. حطينا نتش فوق المية، ومن فوق النتش نحط شادر وننام فوق الشادر، والمية تجري من تحتينا. كان محل المخيم هذا مزروع كرسنة وجلبانة، وإحنا كنا فوق المية، ننام فوق المية. ولما سنتها أجى الثلوج صعب جدا، طار الخيام. استؤجر المخيم لمدة 99 عام، وهذا كان يعني عادة الاستئجار. مكثنا على هذا الحال في 55. بنى الوكالة بدأ سنة 1955. كمان مرحلة بنوا باقي المخيم على أساس إنه ما يخلوا خيام بالمنطقة. كانت في الأول، أول ما كان الأجرة يعطونا 2 كيلو طحين للنفر للي بيشتغل، يعني إلهاء، يعني إلهاء.
يحاولوا ينسوك يعني.
نعم، يحاولوا ينسونا عن البلد وعن الأرض وعن انسحبت الأردن من فلسطين في 6/6/1967. انسحبت الأردن من هنا وحلت إسرائيل مكانها. الآن بعد عام 67 وقفوا توزيع التمويل. يعني إذا كان إحنا ناسبونا بالناس، إحنا معيشتنا متدنية، لكن عندنا مقومات الحياة، يعني لأنه لا أرض لنا ولا مصدر رزق ولا عمل إلا عمل. إحنا عندنا محلها الغرفة فقط. يعني هنا وإحنا قاعدين يخش الجندي الإسرائيلي بيأخذنا وبيطالب
عادي. بعد عندك السنوات الأخيرة قامت وكالة الغرف بتشغيل لاجئين تقليص هاي الخدمات، بطلوا يقدموا خدمات صحية، بطلوا يقدموا تعليم، يعني
لإنهاء القضية،
لإنهاء قضية اللاجئين،
لإنهاء القضية، يعني
ظلوا موجودين بالمخيمات.
فكل ما الوكالة ارتفعت عنا كل ما ساء مستوى المعيشة. في النهاية لا حياة لنا ولا عيش لنا إلا بالعودة إلى وطننا تحت أي ظرف كان، وسيأتي يوم اللي نعود إلى وطننا.
and there's warrior flags here, and you'll see all throughout the whole encampment there's warrior flags. And a lot of these flags that are flying, they represent that. When they fly those, they fly them with pride. Like, this is who we are as Native people. And there's nothing, like the DNA, our DNA is in the dirt and the grass and like the salmon and buffalo. It's all in us. Like, that's how we are connected. Like this, we say this is the blood and bones of our ancestors. When we walk on this, you know, we respect this earth, but it connects us and it ties us. Like our sister Aloha says, like our roots go so deep, they go to creation.
This is a fight for, our first medicine, water, and, for our future generations.
7 generations ago, our ancestors thought of us today, and now it's our responsibility to think of the next 7 generations. Because without this water, we cannot be Lakota. We can't do any of our ceremonies without this water. And that's how powerful this water is. It was our first medicine to our people.
This is actual truth. When we say water is life, water is sacred because it is our life-giving source.
I just don't want to leave. I have to fight. I cannot sit back behind a computer and watch all this happen. It's because I said I come from a warrior family. My dad was a warrior, my mom was a warrior, my ancestors were warrior. And so I have to stand up.
Lived on the streets for part of my life in Toronto and grew up on the reserve, so I feel like I'm an able-bodied person to be here. So however I can put work in, whether it be getting arrested or cooking or cleaning up or just, talking to people, connecting with people, and then just sending info back to our res. That's pretty much my role here. I didn't come here on any funding or nothing. I basically came here with a couple $100 in my pocket, but it ain't about money, and we've survived a lot longer, without money. So I know I'm good here.
I started seeing it on Facebook. I can't just stand around, because this is my res. This is for my people. So I started looking out for it, and my boss said no, and so I just up and left. I left everything behind. I quit my job. I left my home. I knew I had family here, so bought everything that I had and just came north and just moved back.
How long are you guys gonna stay out here, you think?
I don't know.
That's how we win.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay. So then, yeah, we just open them, dump them in there.
I just talked security, dude.
When you lived in an old community where there was teepees, you had to conduct yourself differently than you would in a square house where you could go inside and holler at your wife and kids and do things that ain't appropriate. Whereas you live in a community like this with other people, you don't want to be, everyone hears what you're doing. Yeah, living in a community like where we're at here in Cannonball is a beautiful thing because we're learning how to be relatives again. We're learning how to remember the old ways of living and having respect and honor in your everyday life.
Everybody that comes here to the camp should come with skills, whatever skills that they have. that could contribute to the greater betterment of this camp. Also, as Native people, we have to go and actually put something forth for their nation. Like when I went, they asked me what I said. I know how to, help with childbirth. I know about herbs and medicines. I know how to smoke our own meat and smoke our own salmon. And they said, okay, well, we just got a fresh moose and we just built a smoker. So can you teach the people that don't know how this? And so it's about passing on the skills, and that each of us have a skill or a teaching that we could pass on. And then we just become stronger and mightier nations and allied tribes together.
I think that's one thing that's so unique about this camp is we have so many nations here standing together that we have a chance to maybe make the government listen to us. And we also understand that even though we stopped this pipeline, there's many more pipelines trying to come, and it's going to be an ongoing battle. It's going to be an ongoing struggle that our people are going to have to continue to be a part of.
We've never seen anything as big as this, and this is because people want to protect water. This is because people are feeling it in their spirit to come and travel miles and thousands of miles to come here. Like walking around the encampment and meeting all the people, they're all like-minded people. They have a history of resistance. They're not just coming here, with no insight in why we're here. They're coming here very articulate, very educated on the reasons why we're here. And I'm hearing it over and over again that our people have had enough.
Nation, this is what I grew up knowing. It was more or less horses all my life, and it just kind of inspires me being around, different people that want to learn about horses, and I just try to teach them the little bit that I know and as what I've been taught along the way. And this medicine bag kind of just means, the horses are medicine. They're our medicine. They're the ones that take our hurt, and that makes people feel alive again. Whenever they sit on a horse, they say they feel whole. And there's even a couple of girls that I let them around just out here, and I heard them crying, and I was like, and I turned around and I asked them, what are you crying for? And they're like, it's just, I never got to ride a horse in my whole life, and it's the best feeling that I've ever had throughout my whole life.
Why would you put the pipeline under the Missouri River, the second largest watershed in the nation? That will really hurt the poor people, because we can't buy water. We can't truck in water from where they get it and what they do. So we just have to leave. And once we leave our land, that opens to their taking the uranium and the forestry and the oil and everything, because they can use the poisonous water for all of those industries.
What kind of life do I want for my children? Do I just want to be rich for one generation and not worry if my children have clean water? The same water that was here 10,000, 20,000 years ago is still here. The same fresh water is still here. And once we poison that, it don't matter how much money we have or what.
Coming from Secwepemc territory, we've been battling with one of the world's largest mine tailings disaster, Imperial Metals Mount Poly mine. It dumped, hundreds of millions of gallons of toxic mining waste and heavy metals right into our pristine water, including the deepest glacier-fed lake in the world. So we know all too well government and corporations' impacts on our land. They're there to make money off of our resources in our land, while Indigenous people become even more impoverished because they're not only stripping the natural resources from us, but they're also contaminating our salmon, and our salmon is the lifeblood of our people. And so when we talk about fighting these pipelines, we're also talking about self-determination, and we're talking about our own people starting to make decisions on our lands. Our laws, our spiritual laws, our natural laws, they do exist.
And that's just, I think, part of being, you know, part of the First Nations people. You know, you're automatically born into that struggle where the federal government owns you, you know, or thinks they own you. They own your territories.
One of the issues that we want to continue to address back up home is that we could be fighting these corporations all day, all night, 365 days a year. We could be fighting with the government. It's the government that's continuing to issue the permits.
You know, the UN put a statement out in favor of us, but the United States they don't care about the UN. The UN's just like Indians to them. Say whatever you want. You know, they don't care. UN can support us all they want as a nation to nation, but the United States just laughs at the UN. To me, why go to the UN when the United States could care less? We need America to look at us as an individual nation and live up to their word that their forefathers said. They have no honor. They have no honor whatsoever.
They make treaties and laws and they never hold up to them. So this is bigger than the pipeline. This has been going on for forever. Since her ancestors, since his ancestors, since you know, and this is what they've been fighting.
We need to know our war history and how our people have stood up and resisted since the very beginning, because we don't even hear that. And we need things to our more modern day war history, like Oka, Gustafson Lake, you know, Wounded Knee. Like, that's what gives this generation the inspiration.
The federal marshals and the army against the people at Wounded Knee. My father was in Wounded Knee, and he fought against the government with arms in an armed struggle. And to us, that was a war. You talk about Sitting Bull, who was the chief that was murdered up here. You talk about Crazy Horse that was murdered at Fort Laramie. These are relatives of ours. These are grandparents of our relatives. So it's not like history to us.
We want to keep our numbers up in this camp, you know, and we know that this camp was created, you know, through prayers, but we also know that, you know, with our prayers, we have to physically stop them with our bodies. You know, I'm willing to do anything, you know. I'm willing to lock down. I'm willing to do whatever. I love my takojas, my grandchildren. I love my, you know, takojas that are coming.
It's the relationships that we build that are the political ties to continue our battle. Like-minded people, warriors, you know, we have a responsibility. It goes deep into our blood and our soul and our spirit. You know, we come from a warrior lineage. We never stop fighting.
Hi, everybody. It's good to be back. So I hope you guys enjoyed those films. Some remarks that I wanted to say are, I think what we can see throughout the entire project, a running theme has been how the native reservations have been, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, a centerpiece for indigenous struggles in the United States, especially in terms of defending indigenous, like indigenous ways of life and an indigenous connection to the land. A lot of the kind of, as we all know, there are hundreds and hundreds of tribes in the United States, and that the Native people are not just one simple people that, although the United States is, through its settler colonialism, kind of created this category of Native people as though it's one block. There's actually a very, each tribe and each group, each family has a very particular relationship to the land and a very particular form of communal life. And a lot of the struggles that are, for a lack of a better word, we would call them national struggles, but I think a lot of Native communities would reject that term. But for lack of a better word, these kinds of national struggles that Native peoples have begun to undertake as separate from generalized civil rights struggles that tend to occur more in cities, those kinds of struggles for sovereignty, let's say, have oftentimes occurred on reservations, actually mainly occurred on reservations. So you have, for example, the struggle, the armed struggle in Pine Ridge, which was referenced at the end of the film. There was a reference to it coming from Vic Camp. He was talking about the struggle that occurred in the 70s in Pine Ridge. Pine Ridge is not terribly far from Standing Rock. It's also a Lakota reservation. Standing Rock is Lakota, and Pine Ridge is Lakota. Standing Rock and Pine Ridge are both kind of prisoner. They're kind of camps almost that were erected after the military combat between the United States military and the Sioux in the late 19th century. And so that's an example, the struggle that occurred in Pine Ridge. You have struggles that occurred in Ganyenge in the early 90s, in Mohawk territory in Quebec, struggles that have occurred in British Columbia in Canada, which were, I think, also mentioned in All My Relations. And so there's obviously this kind of dual track within Native struggles, a civil rights track that is more closely linked to the cities, and then a struggle for land and a struggle for Native autonomy, which is more closely linked to the reservations or takes place on reservations. But there is obviously a lot of dialogue between those two movements. So, for example, the struggle in Pine Ridge was undertaken by AIM, which is a pan-Native organization dealing with or composed of Native peoples who come oftentimes from cities. But but they were invited onto Pine Ridge to protect the people of Pine Ridge against the kind of tribal government, which was supported by the United States Department of Interior. So I don't want to propose too clean a separation, but there is those two tendencies. And then obviously the clearest and most recent manifestation is Standing Rock, where you see intertwining of struggles for Native sovereignty with environmental concerns, which obviously go well beyond just the Native community. And Standing Rock is something that we were lucky enough, Matt and I, to have participated in twice. We made two films, All My Relations, which documents our first trip, and then a second film called Indian Winter that we made a few months later when we returned in late December, or in late December, I think. On the other side of the coin, in the Palestinian scenario, refugee camps have been, in my opinion, the center of a much Palestinian struggle, but in a way precisely for the opposite reason. I mean, in both cases, land is central, but while in reservations, oftentimes, not all reservations, by the way, are the Native people's indigenous land. For example, the Cherokee or the Choctaw were displaced onto other land that is not theirs, and they were given reservations on land that is not their indigenous land. But in many cases, they're on their indigenous land. On the opposite side of the coin, with the Palestinian case, the Palestinian refugees are, the camp is precisely defined by the fact that Palestinians are not on their native land. So land is extremely important in the Palestinian refugee case of the Palestinian refugee camps and in the political struggles, but for precisely the opposite reason. Land becomes kind of the present absent in struggles that go on Palestinian refugee camps. Even in the case of the first Intifada and the second Intifada, which took place in the West Bank and in Gaza, where in the West Bank, a majority of the Palestinians are on their native land, the struggles still began in refugee camps. So in places where the people were not from that land, they were displaced from one land onto another. So that I thought that was something that was kind of interesting. The position, since it's Land Day, the position of land in both of those spaces. In one case, the struggle being conducted on the land, in the other case, the struggle being conducted for the land, with the land as something that is not there, and because it's not there, defines at its most essence the space itself. Till today, I think these issues remain. So I'm in Lebanon right now, and Lebanon is suffering greatly from inflation and from obviously from the coronavirus and from a huge explosion that happened on August 4th, and it's affecting obviously, all Lebanese communities, but of course, communities that are at risk, refugee communities are suffering, tremendously. With the coronavirus in particular, they say that Palestinians, refugees, of course, people living in camps, people living in Palestinian refugee camps, because of the poor sanitary conditions and the pre-existing health conditions that are in at-risk communities, and the impossibility of kind of isolation, both because the camps are so crowded, and B, because oftentimes people have no choice but to work. They can't afford to stay at home. The chance of mortality in Palestinian refugee camps from coronavirus is 3 times higher than the national average. And this is in a country where people are dying quite a bit from corona in Lebanon, and the rate of infection for coronavirus in Lebanon is much more than even than other regional countries. But within the camps, the rate of mortality is 3 times higher than the average. So even in these kinds of situations where there's kind of a universal base of problems, or a universal position of problems having to do with corona, and in the Lebanese case having to do with inflation and political instability, there's the Palestinian refugee camps still end up being kind of the eye of the storm. And I think something similar, and Nadal can talk more about this, within the Syrian conflict, where you have a conflict of the Syrian civil war and the Syrian revolution that ostensibly doesn't directly involve the Palestinian refugee camps, but still the Palestinian refugee camps, Yarmouk in particular, manages to be in so many ways the eye of the storm. So just to bring it back to today, and I think it's the case with native reservations in the United States and corona and the current situation. I don't know if Matt has something more comments about that. He's in America presently.
Yeah, real quick, and I'd like to turn it over to the others, but just to follow up on what Malik was saying, Native Americans are 5 times more likely to be hospitalized from COVID in the United States, and have the highest death rate in the country among any population, which is particularly affecting the elders of the community, which retain a lot of the knowledge, historical memory, access to their languages, etc. So losing a kind of layer of elders in these communities will accelerate certain aspects of colonization. And just real quick, I just want to mention, Kanahus Manuel, who's one of the women in our native film. She's currently living in an encampment to blockade a pipeline in British Columbia and Western Canada, because these are ongoing movements and struggles. And there's another large resistance to a pipeline, Line 3 in Minnesota in the United States. So just to mention, it wasn't all this Dakota Access Pipeline in North Dakota. There's many different infrastructural projects which are impacting Native communities and basically all communities, but in particular it's been Indigenous movements that have been in the forefront of resisting them. When Biden took office in January, he canceled a major pipeline, the Keystone Pipeline, which Trump had approved. This has been going back and forth for about a decade. This will be a major pipeline operation that people have been resisting for a long time. And just worth noting, since it's Land Day, Biden nominated as his Secretary of Interior a Native woman, Deb Haaland. And, people might have different, interpretations of what that means, but it's, it is historic. There's never been a Native American in the cabinet of the United States government before, or a Native American, of any gender. And that she is in the Department of Interior is interesting or kind of remarkable or something. And, we'll see how she's able to leverage these various policies and pipelines and infrastructural projects, which are impacting Native communities, et cetera. But I don't want to take up too much time. I'd really love to hear from some of the other guests and panelists. And thanks again for having us and watching the films.
Thank you so much, Malik and Matt, for sharing those incredible short films with us. And I also look forward to being able to discuss them in a bit more detail. But I'm also very much looking forward to hearing from Mark from Western Sahara Campaign. So I'll pass over to you now, Mark.
Must remember to unmute. So yes, thank you very much. First, I'd like to thank the Palestine Solidarity Campaign for inviting us to speak tonight. People may have heard about one of Trump's last acts was to trade Morocco establishing diplomatic relations with Israel for the United States recognising the occupation of Western Sahara by Morocco. So, as you can see by what I just stated, land is key to the struggle of the Sahrawi people. I'm not Sahrawi and I cannot speak about the importance of land to them. I'll say something towards the end of it, but just for your information, the word Sahrawi, which is Sahara with W-I on it, means people of the Sahara. So obviously they identify with the land which they come on. And more interestingly, they're a nomadic people. So their concept of land is very different to the concept of other people. Some of the Native Americans may have similar traditions, but their knowledge of the land is shaped over many generations of traveling across it. So it's a different concept of land, but I think there are resonances with the struggles we've already heard about. A lot of people will maybe not know a lot about Western Sahara in the UK. It's not an issue which gets much coverage. I've been chair of the Western Sahara Campaign UK for a number of years, and we have been going since the 70s to try and establish solidarity between the UK people and the Sahrawi people. The Western Sahara, in terms of land, clearly is where it is. It's at the west end of the Sahara, where it meets the Atlantic. And historically, as I said, it was an area which the nomadic group called the Sahrawi travelled across. They are a separate ethnic group. They speak a language called Hassaniya, which is akin to Yemenite dialects of Arabic. And they lived there for many years until the Spanish arrived and colonised the coast. And there were struggles with the Spanish. In 1884, the Berlin Congress established the Spanish Sahara, which was an area of land drawn on a map. The lines are very straight across the desert, and they put lines right across nomadic travel lines, obviously. Sahrawi people continue to live nomadic lives. Some of them settled with the Spanish traders on the coast, but most of them travelled nomadically across the desert still, and resisted Spanish occupation into the 20th century, into the 1930s. There was still war with the Spanish. Towards the end of the colonial period, the United Nations was tasked for self-determination, determining the future of the Western Sahara for a referendum of self-determination. Morocco, which had always claimed sovereignty over the area, did a deal with Franco on his deathbed and basically invaded the territory with Mauritania. Most Sahrawi fled into the desert, and a lot of them ended up in refugee camps in Algeria near a place called Tindouf, and they've been there now for over 40 years. So it's about 1976. Some others stayed in Western Sahara, and a huge number of Moroccan settlers also moved in. So the colonial occupation included moving settlers in and also exploiting the natural resources. The Sahrawi people under the leadership of the Polisario Front fought a guerrilla war using nomadic skills for 20 odd years and defeated the Mauritanian government by marching on their capital, and the Moroccans then seized the whole of the territory. Well, the whole of the territory. They built a wall across the territory, which is akin to the wall in Palestine, Israel, and what happened was therefore the effectiveness of the war the Polisario could partake in was curtailed, and there was a peace deal done in 1990. United Nations agreed to organise that referendum of self-determination, and we're now here 30 years later. So that's a really quick history. I thought it was important. In terms of land, obviously, you have two groups of Sahrawis. Some are living in refugee camps who strongly who have been there for 30, 40 years. I first went there in 1990. I went back a couple of years ago. The kids I met were still living in refugee camps 30 years later. And they were, grown ups. And there was a very strong identity in those refugee camps of being from the Western Sahara. In the occupied territory, it is illegal to call for a referendum of self-determination. It's illegal to display the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic flag. And there is mass human rights abuse of Indigenous Sahrawi who protest their right to self-determination. The other thing is just a little bit about our role. Obviously, historically, the United Kingdom has not been a big player in the area. France and Spain, traditionally, in that area of the Maghreb. So the UK government has always had a role in terms of being on the United Nations Security Council, but has never played a major part in it. Until recently, when Boris Johnson has, as part of his post-Brexit trade deals, done a deal with the Moroccan government, which includes the ability to import goods from the Western Sahara as if they were from Morocco, quite akin to what happens in Palestine and Israel. So the issue around trade has been very important to the campaign, and we've taken the British government to court and won a first case, and hopefully we'll win the second one, which is coming up soon. Recently, the Trump deal and the failure of the United Nations to act has created a new dynamic, and the Polisario Front have declared the ceasefire over and have launched military attacks on Moroccan positions on the wall. And there's been intense lobbying of the Biden administration to get them to rescind the agreement that Trump made. So we're campaigning on both the trade issue and also the need for the United Nations to intervene. Just a little bit on land. As I said, I'm not Sahrawi, and I think land is something which you connect with if you live in a culture where the land is important. Obviously, in the UK, a lot of us have become divorced from farmland and things like that, but we still strongly identify, or some of us do, with the land that we come from. There's a very telling saying in the film we just saw at the beginning. It said DNA is in the dirt, and I think if you ask a Sahrawi, that's what they would say. The land which they've travelled over for generations has shaped their culture, the way they live, and by building a wall across it and by occupying it, not only the Moroccans haven't just stolen land, they've stolen their identity. And I think that would be common across the struggles that we hear from. The other interesting thing, flags. Flags are very important to Sahrawi, particularly the national flag. The Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic is recognised by the Organisation of African Unity, African Union, says how long I've been involved, the African Union, as one of the countries, because they have a principle whereby colonial boundaries established in Berlin should be respected. So they recognise the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic. They have a flag very similar to the Palestinian flag with the red crescent and star in the middle of it. And that is something which is very key to their identity. Allegiance to the struggle is also important. The Polisario Front are very well supported across the Sahrawi diaspora and within the occupied territories and within the refugee camps. And they have forged an identity. Now, it is interesting because as a reaction to colonialism, the national identity of the Sahrawi is not something I'm an expert of, but traditionally have tribal structures, so tribal leaders, etc., and they all came together in a unit. But again, it was based on where they travelled to and their travel lines and what role they had in society. So the whole thing is tied up with the land. If you go to visit the camps, I haven't been into occupied territories, people talk about aching to return forever. That's all they talk about. They just want to go home. Even if they were born in the camps, they still want to go home. It's a really strong identity. When I first went there in 1990, very few physical structures existed in the camp. This was only 14 years or so after they left, 16 years. They had tents still. They were still living nomadic life, up and returned to the territory which they were from. When I went back 2 or 3 years ago, there were far more concrete structures, which was quite telling. However, every family still have a tent pitched outside their concrete structure. So as soon as they get the signal, they will pick up their tent and they will go back to their land. The elders are also very important. I noticed that in both of the films, because the elders carry the traditions, and although it's quite a young population, they have a lot of respect for the traditions of their forefathers and mothers. And so I should also say women play a very interesting role in Sahrawi society as well, in the way in which they, in nomadic terms, they stayed with the area where they were living, and the nomads went off and traded. So they were very much the root of the culture as well, and have a very strong role in Sahrawi society, and run a lot of the administration of the camps. It's about all I wanted to say. I mean, going back to the Western Sahara campaign, I mean, you can search for us online and find us and join our campaigns. But for me, this is about sharing information and knowledge and understanding of different struggles. So I'm just grateful that I've been able to share a little bit of my knowledge of the Western Sahara tonight, and I'm more than happy to ask questions.
Thank you so much. Okay. Yeah, that was brilliant. So much interesting and important information you've shared with us. I'll now pass over to Nidal and let him speak. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is really interesting, the conversation. I would start from where a guy in the second film was talking about the UN and the USA. Actually, I'm going to tell you a story. Back, I think it was 2014, I was invited to the United Nations. I was new here in the US, maybe 6 or 7 months after my arrival in the US. I was invited to the United Nations for a panel organized by the EU countries, US and UK. And I don't know, maybe some Arab countries as well, Saudi Arabia, UAE, to talk about the besieged areas in Syria, when the Syrian government was besieging my neighborhood in Al Yarmouk camp for Palestinian refugees. I talked about the brutality of the Syrian government, about the destruction in the camp, in the neighborhoods, about the brutality of the civil war in Syria, about how it started as a peaceful revolution and then turned into an armed conflict. I talked about everything, and then I talked about my camp, where I was born. About 150,000 Palestinians used to live there, were born as refugees, or some of them, like my father's generation, were born in Palestine and came as refugees to Syria. So I am a second generation, and others in other cases like third generation refugees. And then I said, because I was sitting in the United Nations, and the best thing to say while you're sitting in the United Nations is to emphasize the resolutions. So I said, I just want to remind you all that I am still a refugee, because there is a resolution, it's called 194, that Israel is refusing to implement. And why, the second I said that, someone from the audience who I knew, he texted me, he said, this will be your last time going to the United Nations. And actually it was. Once I said that, the UK representative to the United Nations, he left the hall. And after I finished, the representative of the Saudi Arabia, he came to me and he said, your speech was a bomb that exploded here, and you caused us a lot of problems. I did not realize what I said, and it took me some time to understand the dynamics of the international community system, or the international system, how it works. And later on, I started really realizing that the UN can say whatever they want to say, but not all the time, because there are things they are allowed to say, but people are not allowed to repeat. And this applies for us, Palestinian refugees, who were like, their life, their culture was interrupted and disturbed many times. I came from Al Yarmouk camp, which was established in 1957, and it was destroyed completely by the Russian air jets in 2018. But between 1948 and 2018, there were so many camps were destroyed. In Lebanon, Black September in Jordan, Tal Zatar in Lebanon in 1976, and a lot, and then Nahr al-Bared in Jordan as well. And we are not allowed to continue either, like to have a stable misery, if you want to say, like it's always should be. And whenever we think that this is the wars, no, we discovered that no, there is wars. And what's worse than like being here, sitting in the United States, trying to be a refugee for a third time in your life, and you have a Swedish brother and Norwegian sister and another Swedish sister. I have like an international family now, and sitting here in the US, like trying to be a refugee. I'm saying I'm trying to be here in the US to be a refugee is so complicated. I mean, I applied for asylum maybe in 2014, I think, January 2014, and now it's March, the end of March 2021, and then still waiting for a decision. I mean, this movement of refugees is really heartbreaking, and as Mark was saying, there is something. It's not only about land. Land is very important, but there is always something about your culture, about what you are familiar to, who is familiar with who. You have a community of people who were in the first place were picked up from their land, and they were thrown in other countries, like in Syria and Lebanon and Jordan, and they started in new communities. And starting a community is a hard work to do. Keeping your culture alive is very hard work to do, and it ends up to have like to be a refugee and live a refugee is a very hard life to live. It's not easy. However, I don't want to talk a lot about these things, but I want to say something. There should be kind, or I would say, like with the Arab Spring, we had really a big ambitions. We were like really optimistic about the region and the future of the region. But then when you discover that this whole international community that's sitting in the headquarters in the UN is building alliances with dictatorships in the region and disturbing the life of normal people and inhabitants in the region, this is where you realize that this whole world really needs a revolution to change this international system that's sitting in the headquarters in New York. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone for the really interesting contributions. And we've received some comments from the audience. So I'll go ahead and ask one of them here, which is asked, what is the level of consciousness and synergy between the Palestinian struggle and the Native American communities? And I suppose to expand that slightly, what role does a consciousness of an international solidarity movement play within these various struggles that you've all talked about? Does anyone would like to take the question first?
Yeah, I can respond a bit to that quickly. I think, relatively high in terms of native consciousness and awareness of the Palestinian movement, because of how mediatized the Palestinian movement has been, especially over the last 20 years, with groups like yourselves and others. There's a fairly high level of Palestinian solidarity compared to the Sahrawi, for example, or other movements, I think, or the Kurdish movement, has, some slightly less, than trying to build and develop. I think the Palestinian movement, relatively speaking, there's a high degree of awareness to such an extent that I think even people in New York City or kind of cities in the United States are more aware of what's happening, in the West Bank than there would be about indigenous movements, nearby them. There's probably a higher awareness of the so-called Israel-Palestine conflict thousands of miles away, than there is about native movements inside the United States. And that's something about our project, to put these kind of two examples of settler colonialism in dialogue, is to kind of highlight the resonances between them. And also, this recent work we've been doing, with Western Sahara, Kashmir, Kurdistan, is to illustrate other kind of movements, examples around the world where there's similar dynamics taking place. But yeah, I think there is an awareness of Palestine, especially there was the international solidarity movement about 20 years ago, which brought a lot of Western and American activists into the West Bank in the early mid 2000s, really raised the consciousness, including among Native Americans, were visiting the West Bank and refugee camps in Lebanon, etc. So there is some awareness.
If you allow me to, go ahead, Madam. Go ahead.
I'm just saying. Then you, I think Palestinian and Native solidarity has gone through two phases. I think there was a phase in the late 70s which had to do with the global prominence of the left at that time, where there were AIM is the American Indian Movement, probably the largest pan-Native organization, militant organization. They visited Lebanon during the Civil War. They had delegations to the PLO, and simultaneously the PLO had delegations there. A funny anecdote is they said the only time they saw a limousine on Pine Ridge was when Yasser Arafat was visiting. But so there was this period of solidarity that was maybe more militant in the 70s. And then I think there was a period in the 80s and 90s and into 2000s of a kind of recession in solidarity. And then that solidarity, I think, is picking up recently in a more coming from the kind of intersectionality, coming more maybe from traditional activist circles, students, etc. Cultural nature, the increasingly multicultural nature of the American university, where you have Native students and Palestinian. I mean, there are simply more Palestinians in the United States than there were even when I was young. There's much more knowledge of it than there used to be, and there is increasingly more knowledge of Native struggles, but very, 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 very little still, even today. When we went to Standing Rock, just one more quick anecdote. The first thing we saw was a Palestinian flag, so that gives you an idea of the kind of level of solidarity there. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that it feels like there is a huge solidarity with the Palestinian cause, but also people are not aware of the complexity of the Palestinian cause, and this is why you find a lot of divisions when it comes to the Palestinian refugees thing, especially after what happened in Syria, especially within the left circles. It's a bit complicated. I just wanted to mention it and highlight it.
In terms of the Western Sahara, international solidarity has traditionally relied more on the African nations than the Arab nations, largely because it wasn't a member of the Arab League and wasn't allowed to join. And if you can see what Trump has just done in relation to trading recognition of the Western Sahara for Morocco's position on Palestine, I think, you know, that reveals some of the history to that. And there has been strong support in Spain and France over many years. There are large solidarity movements there, but they're not very politically effective in changing their government's positions. Spain and France are key in breaking deadlock. There is a movement in America, quite a small movement. There are people working in Congress on it. And Polisario Front has spent a lot of time building up diplomatic relations with countries across the world. So there are representatives of Polisario Front in most important countries, and they coordinate solidarity with official solidarity movements like my own Western Sahara Campaign UK. And we have increasing links with the occupied territories activists as well. With direct links, social media has opened that up, and the information we get now is far better quality. So the ability to do practical solidarity in struggles has increased as well. Western Saharans, if you speak to them, they support the Palestinian struggle, but I think official relationships have not been good. And I'm never spoken to them about the American nation and their position on that, but I think they would be sympathetic and supportive. And I suspect the American representatives of the Polisario may have already reached out to them, because they are very like that. They reach out for support and solidarity wherever they can find it.
Thank you, Mark. We have another question regarding the Native American struggle, and the question is, to what extent has the Native American struggle become a civil rights struggle as opposed to a struggle for collective national rights? I wonder if Malik and Matt would like to answer that one.
Yeah, just real quick. I think one of the dynamics with, indigeneity and refugeehood is this push towards assimilation, which is basically, ends the kind of process of the settler colonial project. Pushing, the process of urbanization, putting Native peoples away from their traditional homelands and into cities, and granting them citizenship in the United States was another example of a form of colonization. So especially this last 50 years or last century, there's been an increasing move to make it seem as if it's a civil rights struggle and not a national struggle or a struggle of sovereignty over land, especially. But in many ways, this is a colonial way of seeing the so-called Native issue in the United States as being one of civil rights, or a so-called humanitarian question rather than a political or national question. And I think that's similar. Nidal can speak better than I am, but I think that's similar in the question of refugeehood is precisely to kind of get rid of the refugee question, to pretend as if there's not refugees is one of the hopes of the settler colonial project, probably in many of these examples, but I don't want to speak to that too much.
I wanted to say on the Native issue, I think a big part of the difference between precisely what Matt was saying, the civil rights aspect versus the sovereignty aspect, is also the fact that of fighting as your particular tribe or as your particular people, and not, of course there is this political category of Native people, which is important, but when you look at a lot of the struggles that occur on the reservation, they are struggles that are tied to a particular, for example, we're doing some work with the Mohawk Warrior Society, and their kind of political outlook is deeply rooted in the political philosophy and in the social philosophy and the way of life and the worldview of the Mohawk people in particular. And when you create this blanket category called Native, which obviously never existed prior to settler colonialism, that changes it. And kind of going off of what Mark was saying, Native people also, many of the tribal names are actually just simply the names of the places where they are. So people of the high hills, or people of the pines, or people of the two rivers. The life is really intimately tied to their land. And one last thing we were working on, Matt and I and Vanessa, another friend of ours who was also co-directed and helped and shot All My Relations. We recently completed a film about Bedouins in Palestine, which will be out on February 12th. And you see a similar kind of effort with Israel to, within the West Bank, consolidate all of the Bedouin gatherings into one location, again, to eradicate the differences between these different tribes and their particularized relationship to the land. And so again, to kind of take the specificity out of these individual communities and their particular relationship to the land, and then kind of create this kind of blanket category. And it's this blanket category from which I think civil rights struggles emerge. And so I think you have to be critical, because of course civil rights struggles are important, and insofar as that, as the political category that makes civil rights struggles have already been constructed by colonial powers, that category is useful. But the kind of categorization that makes civil rights struggles possible to begin with are already constructed by settler colonialism, and oftentimes it's also good to keep a space that rejects those, that rejects that category, that rejects the category of simply Native or simply Bedouin, and reaffirms the much more individualized characters of individual communities that makes struggles for sovereignty possible. And a lot of that obviously has to do with a very intimate and particular connection to the land.
I could say something about that question in terms of Western Sahara. If you spoke to most Saharis, they would say their basic human right is self-determination, and all other rights would be, that's what they are fighting for now. And yes, civil rights are important, but they would always be secondary to that right of self-determination. And it's probably because they are still a liberation struggle, a part of that liberating the land from the colonialists. And it's just that the colonialists changed from Spain to Morocco. So that's part of their identity. But I think also the way in which, feeding a little bit on what I was saying about the different tribes in Native America, there are different identities within the Sahari culture, and the Moroccans have tried to destabilize the Sahari identity by emphasizing different tribal groupings, which is often a tactic, which is, you say, it's sort of converse to what you were saying. It's quite interesting. And I think it's probably because it's bedded in much more in a national liberation struggle, where the identity of the nation was important to the Sahari Democratic Republic. They have quite creative ideas about nomadic government and all that sort of stuff, but essentially they've accepted that the colonial boundaries are the boundaries which they will respect. So I think that may be the difference between the two struggles in that sense.
I would just highlight very quickly that it's not only now we are in a phase regarding Palestinian refugees. I'm saying I think like we passed the phase that we are interrupting or disturbing the Palestinian culture or in our identity or entity in general. Now it's coming in a higher cost, and it's dismantling completely the Palestinian refugees' culture and identity and entities around in the neighboring countries like in Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. And it might sound really awful and ugly, what I would say, but it's a reality, it's a fact. We cannot ignore it on the ground. Now it's happening in my neighborhood that the Israelis are and the Russians, they are discreting the graves and exhuming bodies to find and to test and to find the Israeli disappeared in the struggle, in the 60 years of struggle with between Palestinians and the Israelis. To this extent, I think it exceeded the limits where like people can continue their life as refugees or as normal people now, and they are just left by themselves. Or to survive on their own. And I would close to say, like in Syria, there were about 550 Palestinian refugees lived in 12 camps. The biggest one was Yarmouk camp, and then it was completely destroyed in in May 2018, like right in the anniversary of Al-Nakba. It was destroyed, and people were like evacuated to the north, and now they are kind of limbo. They don't know what to do, because there is not even a UN agency that can help them, because all refugees in this world, they have their own, they have the UNHCR, and Palestinians, they have their own. It's UNRWA, and UNRWA is only for work, and it's not at all in its mandate to protect or to resettle. So your life as a Palestinian refugee, once you are picked up out of your camp and thrown somewhere else, it's another struggle completely that you have no next step. You have to take boats, you have to walk, and this is what happened. Like about 100,000 Palestinians left Syria by boats or walking from Turkey to Greece and then to Western Europe. So I just wanted to highlight this.
Thank you, Nidal. Before the last question, I guess I'd just like to say that one of the themes which really stuck out from all the films and from what you've all said is the role of history and how present that is in all these struggles. And I suppose it's interesting to think how is history, not just the stories of the past, but also the strategies and the traditions of resistance are being passed on between generations. I think how that happens is very interesting. Our last question from the audience, and we have just 7 minutes, so I suppose if we could all just say our final comments on this one is, can you address the role of UK complicity, historical and ongoing, in each of the struggles we've heard about this evening? So if you would like to say something on that and any final comments, that would be fantastic.
It's a big question. It's probably easiest for me, actually, because the UK connection with Western Sahara has been quite minimal historically. So my job has been to try and get UK government more interested in fulfilling the mandate of the United Nations. And that is the complicity of the United Kingdom government. It is the failure of its role as a member of the Security Council to make the United Nations live up to what it was meant to achieve. We heard earlier from a colleague about his experience in the United Nations. Doesn't surprise me, but that is its complicity. It's an international, and the UK is part of that. And as I said earlier, we are taking the British government to court. So hopefully that will expose the lie of the illegal trade agreement, which we signed with Morocco as one of the first post-Brexit trade agreements. So, and thank you very much for this evening. And also thanks for posting the link to the Western Sahara campaign website on the chat. So if anyone wants to find out more, they're there, and you're more than welcome to contact us through that as well. Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, I think the complicity of Great Britain is, this might sound like a cop-out, but the most truthful answer is intimately tied up with the complicity of the world, in the sense that I think we have yet to find, and this is echoing what Matt was saying at the very beginning, find a language that recognizes humanity of people outside of the framework of citizenship and nation states, whether that's indigenous people or refugees. I think both categories, the category of the indigenous and the core category of the refugee, violate the logic of citizenship and nation states. And the international community has yet found a way to give humanity or recognize, it's not give, recognize the humanity of those categories and create a real political structure that treats these people with dignity that they deserve. And I think Great Britain has a certain level of complicity in it because obviously the world, as we know it, was founded, the nation states of the world were founded in the wake of, English and French colonialism and imperialism. That doesn't mean that Great Britain is responsible for everything that has happened since then. I wouldn't make that argument, obviously, but the world as we know it was created in the wake of the British Empire and the French Empire and several other empires. And so that's the world that we live in, and that's the world that we have to contend with and deal with. And so I think the question, whether it's natives or Palestinians or Western Sahara, is bound up with that larger question.
Yeah, I mean, like the misery of today is because and only because of the mistakes of the past. And I would just emphasize on what Malik said, that what we are living today has started long time ago with the British Empire and the colonialism in general, when they drew all these lines between around the world from the Persian Gulf or the Arab Gulf to Western Sahara. This is when it started, and they are struggling yet to fix or to admit or recognize their mistakes. And I think it's one of the struggles that we have been really trying over the years is to get the UK to recognize their mistake, that they of what happened, the historical mistake in Palestine, that I'm basically living today because of this mistake as a refugee for the third time. And but I mean, it's good that one or two or three of the Palestinian refugees, my friends who were born in Yarmouk camp, and when the civil war in Syria really escalated, the UK said, look, these people okay, they are Palestinian refugees. Let's give them the British citizenship, and I'm happy for them. But it's really important to for all these walls of citizenships and nationality really to collapse, because at the end of the day, the United Nations itself said the freedom of movement is a human right, and yet to be implemented.
I just want to say thanks again for having us. And of course, it's always a pleasure to dunk on British imperialism and everything it's done around the world. Luckily, as an American, as the representative American here, I can congratulate us on overthrowing the British rule and being a success story in this case. But in more seriousness, I think, we can look to hope and resistance and imagine different overcomings. And I think, I really appreciate these conversations connecting, indigenous movements in the US, Palestine, Western Sahara, again, Kashmir, Kurdistan, etc., and think about, these kind of resistance movements, aside from the nation state itself, we're facing, and obviously a pandemic that no one really anticipated. We need different imaginaries, I think, as Malik and Nidal were saying, about what solidarity means and looks like, and what self-organization means, and how we can really imagine what kind of liberated way of inhabiting the earth or the land we find ourselves on, what that really means or looks like. And I think, these are questions that in the 20th century, radicals thought they had certain answers to. I think in the 21st century, we're going to need some different and updated answers. But it's always a pleasure to blame everything on Britain and the United States. I think we'll need some new answers and questions to think about that. But again, thanks again for having me and organizing this and assembling everyone. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, everybody, for taking part, and thank you for watching. To our audience, I hope you've enjoyed it. Good night.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was really a pleasure.